Section 17 of Volume 1 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 1 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 10. Charlemagne and His Wars, Part 1. The most judicious minds are sometimes led blindly by tradition and habit, rather than enlightened by reflection and experience. Pepin the Short committed at his death the same mistake that his father, Charles Martel, had committed. He divided his dominions between his two sons, Charles and Charlemagne, thus destroying again that unity of the Gallo-Frankish monarchy which his father and he had been at so much pains to establish. But just as had already happened in 746 through the abdication of Pepin's brother, events discharged the duty of repairing the mistake of men. After the death of Pepin, and notwithstanding that of Duke Wefra, insurrection broke out once more in Aquitaine, and the old duke, Hunald, issued from his monastery in the Isle of Rhe to try and recover power and independence. Charles and Charlemagne marched against him, but on the march Charlemagne, who was jealous and thoughtless, fell out with his brother, and suddenly quitted the expedition, taking away his troops. Charles was obliged to continue it alone, which he did with complete success. At the end of this first campaign, Pepin's widow, the Queen Mother Bertha, reconciled her two sons, but an unexpected incident, the death of Charlemagne 2 years afterwards in 771, re-established unity more surely than the reconciliation had re-established harmony. For, although Charlemagne left sons, the grandees of his dominions, whether laic or ecclesiastical, assembled at Corbeny, between Laon and Rheims, and proclaimed in his stead his brother Charles, who thus became sole king of the Gallo-Franco-Germanic monarchy. And as ambition and manners had become less tinged with ferocity than they had been under the Merovingians, the sons of Carloman were not killed or shorn or even shut up in a monastery. They retired with their mother Gerberge to the court of Didier, king of the Lombards. King Charles, says Eginhard, took their departure patiently, regarding it as of no importance. Thus commenced the reign of Charlemagne. The original and dominant characteristic of the hero of this reign, that which won for him, and keeps for him after more than 10 centuries, the name of great, is the striking variety of his ambition, his faculties, and his deeds. Charlemagne aspired to and attained every sort of greatness, military greatness, political greatness, and intellectual greatness. He was an able warrior, an energetic legislator, a hero of poetry. And he displayed all these merits in a time of general and monotonous barbarism, when, save in the Church, the minds of men were dull and barren. Those men, few in number, who made themselves a name at that epoch, rallied round Charlemagne and were developed under his patronage. To know him well and appreciate him justly, he must be examined under those various grand aspects, abroad and at home, in his wars and in his government. In Guizot's History of Civilization in France is to be found a complete table of the wars of Charlemagne, of his many different expeditions in Germany, Italy, Spain, all the countries, in fact, that became his dominion. A summary will here suffice. From 769 to 813, in Germany and Western and Northern Europe, Charlemagne conducted 31 campaigns against the Saxons, Frisons, Bavarians, Avars, Slavons, and Danes. In Italy, 5 against the Lombards. In Spain, Corsica, and Sardinia, 12 against the Arabs. 2 against the Greeks, and 3 in Gaul itself, against the Aquitanians and the Britons. In all, 53 expeditions, among which those he undertook against the Saxons, the Lombards, and the Arabs were long and difficult wars. It is undesirable to recount them in detail, for the relation would be monotonous and useless, but it is obligatory to make fully known their causes, their characteristic incidents, and their results. It has already been seen that, under the last Merovingian kings, the Saxons were, on the right bank of the Rhine, in frequent collision with the Franks, especially with the Austrasian Franks, whose territory they were continually threatening and often invading. Pepin the Short had more than once hurled them back far from the very uncertain frontiers of Germanic Austrasia, and, on becoming king, he dealt his blows still farther, and entered in his turn Saxony itself. In spite of the Saxons' stout resistance, says Eginhard, He pierced through the points they had fortified to bar entrance into their country, and after having fought here and there battles wherein fell many Saxons, he forced them to promise that they would submit to his rule, and that every year, to do him honor, they would send to the general assembly of the Franks a present of 300 horses. When these conventions were once settled, he insisted, to ensure their performance, upon placing them under the guarantee of rights peculiar to the Saxons. Then he returned with his army to Gaul. Charlemagne did not confine himself to resuming his father's work. He before long changed its character and its scope. In 772, being left sole master of France after the death of his brother Charlemagne, he convoked at Worms the general assembly of the Franks, and took, says Eginhard, the resolution of going and carrying war into Saxony. He invaded it without delay, laid it waste with fire and sword, made himself master of the fort of Eresburg, and threw down the idol that the Saxons called Irminsul. And in what place was this first victory of Charlemagne won? Near the sources of the Lippe, just where, more than 7 centuries before, the German Arminius, Hermann, had destroyed the legions of Varus, and whither Germanicus had come to avenge the disaster of Varus. This ground belonged to Saxon territory, and this idol, called Irminsul, which was thrown down by Charlemagne, was probably a monument raised in honor of Arminius, Hermannssaal, or Hermann's Pillar, whose name it called to mind. The patriotic and hereditary pride of the Saxons was passionately roused by this blow, and in the following year, thinking to find in the absence of the king the most favorable opportunity, says Eginhard, they entered the lands of the Franks, laid them waste in their turn, and paying back outrage for outrage, set fire to the church not long since built at Fritzlar, by Boniface, martyr. From that time the question changed its object as well as its aspect. It was no longer the repression of Saxons by invasion of France, but the conquest of Saxony by the Franks, that was to be dealt with. It was between the Christianity of the Franks and the national paganism of the Saxons that the struggle was to take place. For 30 years such was its character. Charlemagne regarded the conquest of Saxony as indispensable for putting a stop to the incursions of the Saxons, and the conversion of the Saxons to Christianity as indispensable for assuring the conquest of Saxony. The Saxons were defending at one and the same time the independence of their country and the gods of their fathers. Here was wherewithal to stir up and foment, on both sides, the profoundest passions, and they burst forth, on both sides, with equal fury. Whithersoever Charlemagne penetrated he built strong castles and churches, and at his departure left garrisons and missionaries. When he was gone the Saxons returned, attacked the forts and massacred the garrisons and the missionaries. At the commencement of the struggle, a priest of Anglo-Saxon origin, whom St. Willibrord, Bishop of Utrecht, had but lately consecrated, St. Lebwin, in fact, undertook to go and preach the Christian religion in the very heart of Saxony, on the banks of the Weser, amidst the general assembly of the Saxons. "What do ye?" said he, cross in hand. "The idols ye worship live not, neither do they perceive. They are the work of men's hands, they can do naught either for themselves or for others. Wherefore the one God, good and just, having compassion on your errors, hath sent me unto you. If ye put not away your iniquity, I foretell unto you a trouble that you do not expect, and that the King of heaven hath ordained aforetime. There shall come a prince, strong and wise and indefatigable, not from afar, but from nigh at hand, to fall upon you like a torrent, in order to soften your hard hearts and bow down your proud heads. At one rush he shall invade the country, he shall lay it waste with fire and sword, and carry away your wives and children into captivity." A thrill of rage ran through the assembly, and already many of those present had begun to cut, in the neighboring woods, stakes sharpened to a point to pierce the priest, when one of the chieftains, named Budo, cried aloud, "Listen, ye are most wise. There have often come unto us ambassadors from neighboring peoples, Northmen, Slavons, or Frisons. We have received them in peace, and when their messages have been heard, they have been sent away with a present. Here is an ambassador from a great god, and ye would slay him!" Whether it were from sentiment or from prudence, the multitude was calmed, or at any rate restrained, and for this time the priest retired safe and sound. Just as the pious zeal of the missionaries was of service to Charlemagne, so did the power of Charlemagne support and sometimes preserve the missionaries. The mob, even in the midst of its passions, is not throughout or at all times inaccessible to fear. The Saxons were not one and the same nation, constantly united in one and the same assembly and governed by a single chieftain. Three populations of the same race, distinguished by names borrowed from their geographical situation, just as had happened amongst the Franks in the case of the Austrasians and Neustrians, to wit, Eastphalian or Eastern Saxons, Westphalian or Westerns, and Angrians, formed the Saxon Confederation. And to them was often added a fourth peoplet of the same origin, closer to the Danes and called the North Albingians, inhabitants of the northern district of the Elbe. These four principal Saxon populations were subdivided into a large number of tribes, who had their own particular chieftains, and who often decided, each for itself, their conduct and their fate. Charlemagne, knowing how to profit by this want of cohesion and unity amongst his foes, attacked now one and now another of the large Saxon peoplets or the small Saxon tribes, and dealt separately with each of them, according as he found them inclined to submission or resistance. After having, in 4 or 5 successive expeditions, gained victories and sustained checks, he thought himself sufficiently advanced in his conquest to put his relations with the Saxons to a grand trial. In 777, he resolved, says Eginhard, to go and hold, at the place called Paderborn, close to Saxony, the general assembly of his people. On his arrival he found there assembled the senate and the people of this perfidious nation, who, conformably to his orders, had repaired thither, seeking to deceive him by a false show of submission and devotion. They earned their pardon, but on this condition, however, that if hereafter they broke their engagements, they would be deprived of country and liberty. A great number amongst them had themselves baptized on this occasion, but it was with far from sincere intentions that they had testified a desire to become Christians. There had been absent from this great meeting a Saxon chieftain called Wittikind, son of Wernekind, king of the Saxons at the north of the Elbe. He had espoused the sister of Siegfried, king of the Danes. He was the friend of Ratbod, king of the Frisons. A true chieftain at heart as well as by descent, he was made to be the hero of the Saxons, just as, 7 centuries before, the Cheruscan Hermann, Arminius, had been the hero of the Germans. Instead of repairing to Paderborn, Wittikind had left Saxony, and taken refuge with his brother-in-law, the king of the Danes. Thence he encouraged his Saxon compatriots, some to persevere in their resistance, others to repent them of their show of submission. War began again, and Wittikind hastened back to take part in it. In 778 the Saxons advanced as far as the Rhine, but not having been able to cross this river, says Eginhard, they set themselves to lay waste with fire and sword all the towns and all the villages from the city of Deutz, opposite Cologne, as far as the confluence of the Moselle. The churches as well as the houses were laid in ruins from top to bottom. The enemy, in his frenzy, spared neither age nor sex, wishing to show thereby that he had invaded the territory of the Franks, not for plunder but for revenge. For 3 years the struggle continued, more confined in area, but more and more obstinate. Many of the Saxon tribes submitted, many Saxons were baptized, and Siegfried, king of the Danes, sent to Charlemagne a deputation, as if to treat for peace. Wittikind had left Denmark, but he had gone across to her neighbours, the Northmen, and, thence re-entering Saxony, he kindled there an insurrection as fierce as it was unexpected. In 782 2 of Charlemagne's lieutenants were beaten on the banks of the Weser, and killed in the battle, together with 4 counts and 20 leaders, the noblest in the army. Indeed, the Franks were nearly all exterminated. At the news of this disaster, says Eginhard, Charlemagne, without losing a moment, reassembled an army and set out for Saxony. He summoned into his presence all the chieftains of the Saxons and demanded of them who had been the promoters of the revolt. All agreed in denouncing Wittikind as the author of this treason. But as they could not deliver him up, because immediately after his sudden attack he had taken refuge with the Northmen, those who at his instigation had been accomplices in the crime were placed to the number of 4,500 in the hands of the king, and by his order all had their heads cut off on the same day, at a place called Verden on the river Aller. After this deed of vengeance the king retired to Thionville to pass the winter there. But the vengeance did not put an end to the war. Blood calls for blood were words spoken in the English Parliament in 1643 by Sir Benjamin Rudyard, one of the best citizens of his country in her hour of revolution. For 3 years Charlemagne had to redouble his efforts to accomplish in Saxony, at the cost of Frankish as well as Saxon blood, his work of conquest and conversion. Saxony, he often repeated, must be Christianized or wiped out. At last, in 785, after several victories which seemed decisive, he went and settled down in his strong castle of Eresburg, whither he made his wife and children come, being resolved to remain there all the bad season, says Eginhard, and applying himself without cessation to scouring the country of the Saxons, and wearing them out by his strong and indomitable determination. But determination did not blind him to prudence and policy. Having learned that Wittikind and Abio, another great Saxon chieftain, were abiding in the part of Saxony situated on the other side of the Elbe, he sent to them Saxon envoys to prevail upon them to renounce their perfidy and come without hesitation and trust themselves to him. They, conscious of what they had attempted, dared not at first trust the king's word, but having obtained from him the promise that they desired of impunity, and besides the hostages they demanded as guarantee of their safety, and who were brought to them on the king's behalf by Amalwin, one of the officers of his court, they came with the said lord and presented themselves before the king in his palace of Attigny-sur-Aisne, whither Charlemagne had now returned, and there received baptism. Charlemagne did more than amnesty Wittikind; he named him Duke of Saxony, but without attaching to the title any right of sovereignty. Wittikind, on his side, did more than come to Attigny and get baptized there. He gave up the struggle, remained faithful to his new engagements, and led, they say, so Christian a life that some chroniclers have placed him on the list of saints. He was killed in 807 in a battle against Gerald, Duke of Swabia, and his tomb is still to be seen at Ratisbon. Several families of Germany hold him for their ancestor, and some French genealogists have, without solid ground, discovered in him the grandfather of Robert the Strong, great-grandfather of Hugh Capet. However that may be, after making peace with Wittikind, Charlemagne had still for several years many insurrections to repress and much rigor to exercise in Saxony, including the removal of certain Saxon peoplets out of their country, and the establishment of foreign colonists in the territories thus become vacant. But the great war was at an end, and Charlemagne might consider Saxony incorporated in his dominions. He had still, in Germany and all around, many enemies to fight and many campaigns to reopen. Even amongst the Germanic populations, which were regarded as reduced under the sway of the king of the Franks, some, the Frisons and Saxons as well as others, were continually agitating for the recovery of their independence. Farther off towards the north, east, and south, people differing in origin and language, Avars, Huns, Slavons, Bulgarians, Danes, and Northmen, were still pressing or beginning to press upon the frontiers of the Frankish dominion, for the purpose of either penetrating within or settling at the threshold as powerful and formidable neighbors. Charlemagne had plenty to do, with the view at one time of checking their incursions, and at another of destroying or hurling back to a distance their settlements, and he brought his usual vigor and perseverance to bear on this second struggle. But by the conquest of Saxony he had attained his direct national object. The great flood of population from east to west came, and broke against the Gallo-Franco-Germanic dominion as against an insurmountable rampart. This was not, however, Charlemagne's only great enterprise at this epoch, nor the only great struggle he had to maintain. Whilst he was incessantly fighting in Germany, the work of policy commenced by his father Pepin in Italy called for his care and his exertions. The new king of the Lombards, Didier, and the new pope, Adrian I, had entered upon a new war, and Didier was besieging Rome, which was energetically defended by the pope and its inhabitants. In 773, Adrian invoked the aid of the king of the Franks, whom his envoys succeeded, not without difficulty, in finding at Thionville. Charlemagne could not abandon the grand position left him by his father as protector of the papacy and as patrician of Rome. The possessions, moreover, wrested by Didier from the pope were exactly those which Pepin had won by conquest from King Astolphus, and had presented to the papacy. Charlemagne was, besides, on his own account, on bad terms with the king of the Lombards, whose daughter Desiree he had married, and afterwards repudiated and sent home to her father, in order to marry Hildegard, a Swabian by nation. Didier, in dudgeon, had given an asylum to Carloman's widow and sons, on whose intrigues Charlemagne kept a watchful eye. Being prudent and careful of appearance, even when he was preparing to strike a heavy blow, Charlemagne tried, by means of special envoys, to obtain from the king of the Lombards what the pope had demanded. On Didier's refusal he at once set to work, convoked the general meeting of the Franks, at Geneva, in the autumn of 773, gained them over, not without encountering some objections to the projected Italian expedition, and forthwith commenced the campaign with two armies. One was to cross the Valais and descend upon Lombardy by Mount St. Bernard. Charlemagne in person led the other, by Mount Cenis. The Lombards, at the outlet of the passes of the Alps, offered a vigorous resistance, but when the second army had penetrated into Italy by Mount St. Bernard, Didier, threatened in his rear, retired precipitately, and, driven from position to position, was obliged to go and shut himself up in Pavia, the strongest place in his kingdom, whither Charlemagne, having received on the march the submission of the principal counts and nearly all the towns of Lombardy, came promptly to besiege him. Chapter 11.